Welcome to It's No Secret, a podcast for Kiwis who want their money questions answered.
Ready, steady, go.
This podcast will answer the money questions you may or may not have on your mind. We'll talk to real Kiwis and share truths about our own financial lives.
Both the successes and the failures. Because the truth is, there is no secret to achieving financial freedom.
Hello and welcome to It's No Secret. I'm Christine.
And I'm Kat.
And today we are back with another Q&A episode. So this is a new format that we've been testing out. We are now on the second version or second time, where basically we run through some commonly asked questions by the listeners and people in our vortex of financial chats.
Yeah.
And I put Kat in the hot seat and ask her all the things.
Woohoo.
Yeah, so it's a bit of a quick fire. And today we have 4 quite different questions that we're going to run through, but
Awesome.
equally as interesting as important. So let's get stuck in.
Okay, before we do though,
yes.
I want to ask, because today is the day after Valentine's Day, and for anyone that's listened to our Valentine's Day episode, we were talking about how much is too much money to spend on Valentine's Day. So before I get put in the hot seat, I'm going to ask you, Christine,
Yes.
how much did your dinner out with Ollie cost last night?
So it ended up costing us $220.
Okay.
Which
Talk to me. Break it down.
Yeah. So
Do we feel like that was reasonable, first of all?
well, Ollie made a comment when we walked out. He's like, oh, it's a bit more than I was expecting. And I was like, okay, interesting, but also not based on what we
Yeah.
ordered. So
Yeah.
he ended up having a glass of wine and a beer, and I had a glass of wine and a soda water. So that's 4 drinks, 3 alcoholic ones. So,
Yep. Cool.
And then we had hummus, one hummus, like a few starters. So there was hummus, ceviche, tomatoes or something.
Yep.
And then we had potatoes, a market fish, and there was one other dish that I'm forgetting. Oh, we had 4 oysters. So
Okay.
and the oysters were like $6 each or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, we didn't have any dessert. So
I
that
feel
was
like
it.
that's fairly reasonable.
Yeah.
I was going to say, like, what you said, 220. So what? That's 110 a head. And if you had a couple of drinks, that just feels like the going rate for a
Nice
at
dinner
least
out.
2-course dinner plus a couple of drinks.
Totally. And that was at Alma in Britomart in Auckland
Okay.
City. So it was
Yeah.
it was like on the upper end of a nice spot.
Yeah.
But yeah. So that was fun.
Fascinating.
That's how much it ended up costing Ollie to
My feedback to Ollie would be, I feel like your bill was lower than, say, the bill we talked about that Luke and I spent the other day, because your dinner is skewed like low on protein. Like you've just ordered one protein.
true.
You know,
Yeah.
if you think
Yeah.
about the things that are priced like more expensive over a menu, you've done heavy on the vegetables, which is a great choice, and then
thank you.
lower on the protein side, just one market fish.
Yes.
I guess you did get the oysters.
and
but-
the ceviche, but still.
Well, true. Yeah, I mean, okay.
But we definitely try to, like, because I think when you order out, like, red meat is traditionally more expensive, I would say, than
Yeah.
fish and
Yeah,
other
it
kind of
tends
stuff.
to be.
So we try to steer away from that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah. Any,
Well, I think that's a great quality, price point.
thank you.
I would not expect Ollie to spend any less, Ollie.
Yeah. So next time, it's only up from there.
This is what he should start budgeting for next year.
Yeah. And how much did I spend? $0 because I was the Valentine, not the Valentine
You
giver.
were invited.
Yes, that's true.
I think that's also the other thing that's a good qualifying point is this booking was made unbeknownst to you and you were invited. So
That's true.
the bill is landing in Ollie's plate.
That's true. And we did have a discussion because I was like, oh, I feel really bad. I haven't done anything for you. But he was like, well, after listening to the Valentine's podcast, thanks for listening, Ollie. He was like, you said that that time is your currency of love, basically. And I was like, yes, my time is valuable too. So that'll be $220 each.
Like, I will send you a bill.
Yeah. I gave you 3 hours.
I
No.
love that. Love that.
But what about you? How much did your Valentine's
Well, we
cost?
did our Valentine's Day before Valentine's Day, so it was on the weekend, and we spent $390 on our dinner, which I've obviously already told you about, but we drank a lot more than you guys did. So I think in terms of that's probably where a lot of the bill went. We had between us, I'm going to out myself here, but we had 2 cocktails each and we shared a bottle of wine. Over, like anyone listening, it was like a 3-hour dinner. So it wasn't like,
Not in the space
a
of an
binge
hour.
drinking situation. Exactly. And then we did have, we had a 3-course meal. So we had, like 2 entrees, 2 mains that we shared and a side. And then we had 1 dessert and a dessert cocktail.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah.
Love it.
And it was an upper end restaurant and our main was like a steak and that kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
I was, in my mind, I was like, I think I went to the toilet just before we went to pay the bill and I was like, I think it's going to be like 400. And then I was like, boom. 390. I'm like, yeah,
crushed it.
I knew it.
Yeah, nice.
But this is very few and far between. I don't think.
It's not an every weekend affair.
I don't even remember the last time. Like last time Luke and I would have had a dinner like that was probably when we were in New York, and that was because it was a holiday. And then prior to that, I'm like, probably not for a very long time. So, yeah.
Totally. Fair enough. Yeah. And it was Valentine's Day, right? So
Exactly.
Before. But yeah, anyway, love it. So if you want to tell us how much you spent on Valentine's Day, please do slide into our DMs because it's been a lot of interesting chats around the cost of love following our previous episode. And if you are wondering what the heck we're talking about, please go back one episode and listen to that because it's actually a really good chat.
Yeah.
But moving on to why we're here today, Q&A. Number one, I have just come into some money, a decent lump sum. What should I do with it if, now there's three kind of scenarios.
Okay.
A, I have no personal debt, no mortgage, and want to start investing. So it's a bit of a clean slate.
Yep. Okay. So this is kind of a nice position to be in because it's a little bit like world's your oyster, right? Yep. So you could think about lots of different types of investment options. You basically, I think, would write down kind of your asset classes that you're thinking about. So are you thinking about shares? Are you thinking about property? Are you thinking about like cash and savings? Are you thinking about alternatives? And then I think it really comes down to, what do you want that lump sum for in the future? Is it something that you want to set aside for, a really long dated goal, which narrows down your options? Or is it something that you want to have some flexibility around because maybe you do want to buy a property at some point and therefore you kind of, vary your outcome there. So I think, most people, and this is obviously a very broad generalization, but a lot of people kind of get into this situation and then park the money in cash because I don't know what to do with it and perhaps leave it there for like far too long and then think about, maybe I should invest in shares or maybe I should invest in property. I would say that investing in property in the sense of like buying an investment property rather than using the money to buy a house has much higher strings attached because you need to have a larger deposit. You've got to pass various serviceability. There's obviously tax outcomes now that various things aren't deductible. You have like bright line tests to consider. So you have a minimum kind of holding period that you need to hold an investment property. There's just more thresholds that one needs to overcome. Not to mention you're also a landlord and you have like that headache as well. Yeah. There's more thresholds, I think, for people to overcome in that option as opposed to saying, okay, I want to invest this money in the share market. Ideally in some kind of like well-diversified, low-cost fund, particularly if it's the very first time you're investing, rather than throwing the money all into like one particular company. So I think that kind of narrows down people's options a bit, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think this is an important point to make between, let's say chucking that on a mortgage. Oh, no, sorry, if you don't have a mortgage.
Yes.
Like taking on a new mortgage.
And I think a lot of people, like if you asked people on Reddit, right, a lot of people would probably say, go and buy a house. And I think it's like that is still valid if you want to buy your own home to live in. But if it's a pure investment property, there are now more considerations because, particularly with the bright line test, you have a much longer holding period required for that property before you start to incur like tax penalties if you were to sell it than you do say with shares, right? Like let's say, you decide I don't need this money for a while. I don't really know what I want to do. And you do invest in diversified share funds for 5 years and then your situation changes and you're like, cool, I'm going to now do something else. You've just got a few less administrative and potential tax headaches than, say, going down the investment property path. Yeah. That said, a lot of people just love property, so that's also an option.
Yeah. Bob's your uncle.
Yeah. Although, actually, now that I'm on the property bandwagon talking about that, I'm like, I guess the other caveat is, like, you can just invest in shares and not really have to think about it much again outside of having your tax kind of probably done by your provider for you every year and, checking in that the shares or the funds that you chose are great. Whereas even if, let's say, you buy a home, you then therefore have a whole flow-on effect of expenses and other things that you need to think about because you're now a homeowner. It's not as like clean-cut black and white.
So would you then, like, let's say you do decide I want to invest in property, would you then, let's say you, I don't know, maybe had like 100K to invest, would you take 80K of that and then keep 20, like as a buffer?
Yeah, or? I mean, I reckon it just totally comes down to what you can even afford.
Yeah.
right? Like if you went down the path of like, no, I think property is a thing for me, the first thing would be go and chat to a broker, because even if you do have a big lump sum, you need to have some kind of serviceability. So that may be a draw card for people, particularly if they are younger, that perhaps their income level is the thing that's restricting them from buying a property that they want to live in versus the deposit that they have. So there's that. Go and talk to a broker, figure out if you're even close. And then that also kind of narrows down your options, right? Because even if, let's say, you are lucky enough to have a lump sum like $100,000, if it's not going to get you into the property that you want, maybe you park that idea and, go down the shares or other path for a while first.
Yeah, nice. And how much, do you think is the threshold to see an advisor, before you go down deciding the asset, or can you just DIY yourself?
Well, define decent lump sum for me.
Well, I'm thinking maybe 100K plus.
Okay. If you had 100K and you right now have like $1 in your bank account, that's obviously significantly meaningful for you.
Yeah.
If your net worth is $2 million and you get 100K, it's probably also meaningful, but it's potentially not like paralyzing from a, you feeling confident to make a decision point of view. Whereas, if you were to get 500K, that potentially is. So I think it's just in the context of your current financial position, how many assets you have, what assets you're familiar with, if you ever invested before, that type of stuff. The caveat being that it is somewhat challenging to receive independent advice on a relatively small lump sum of money, particularly if that lump sum of money is not to then be invested and managed by a financial advisor.
Right. And why is that?
Because their incentives are misaligned in the industry, right? If you are an individual that has, let's say you get $100,000 and you've got $10,000 to your name and you want to just have independent advice from someone to tell you what you should do with that $100,000, if that person's not going to end up managing that money on your behalf after that piece of advice, they need to be paid for their time in some capacity, because they're obviously imparting their expertise and spending time to figure out, the best option for you. And I don't think New Zealanders are used to paying an upfront service fee for that. And not a lot of advisors are used to charging an upfront service fee for just that piece of advice.
Yeah. Nice.
It's a bit tricky.
Some good context, though. I think it's important to distinguish if someone decides that they do want to go down that route.
And I think this is why people end up asking the internet or friends and family and stuff. But I think that's where it's you have to figure out, is this a meaningful amount for you relative to your current assets and experience? How concerned are you that you'll make the wrong decision, or a decision that, would set you down the wrong course of action rather than the right course? And then do a lot of reading, a lot of I guess people could land in the right place just from self-education as well.
Yeah, nice. Love it. Okay, next scenario. I have a lump sum of money, I have a mortgage and a young family. So this is kind of your stage,
demographic.
Right? Yeah. So, and you've also recently talked on the podcast about...
this literally was my life.
Yeah, literally.
Okay, I'll talk in some specifics on this because people will like it. So I think I have mentioned this in the past, but 2 years ago now, my Oma passed away, who was my last living grandparent. She was about to turn 101. My dad is an only child. He inherited the vast majority of her asset base. And then my brother and I had a carve out kind of under her will to inherit some of the money based on the sale of a property. And we've kind of gotten that in some chunks because, long story short, there was some tax that needed to be paid in Australia on the sale of the property. So Mum and Dad basically sold the property, gave us each a little bit of money to then figure out what the tax bill would be. And if there was any left over, they would give us some more. So I think I was inherited maybe 90,000 Australian dollars. So let's say $100,000 New Zealand, and we're about to get maybe another 30,000. So... Nice. In the size of, I think I talked about at the end of last year, our net asset base outside of our business investments being somewhere around $1 million and $1.5 million.
Yep.
That's still fairly meaningful, right? That's 10% of what we kind of have to work with. And we also have a mortgage of $800,000. So, and we have a kid that is very expensive. I mean, I'm also expensive. I shouldn't just blame Lily.
But Lily's hungry.
I'm also the problem. So is Luke. $400 dinners don't come cheap. But we have obviously been faced with this actual situation. So at the current time, we have just parked the money in a fairly accessible, liquid, like low risk investment, which is a cash fund, because it's returning a higher rate of interest than like just our standard bank account. And we've just done that on the basis that a lot of our mortgages are fixed, so we didn't have an opportunity to pay a chunk off like immediately. And then also we are just not 100% sure if we want to pay off, you know, all of our mortgage. We're not really sure what the next like 6 to 12 months looks like for us in terms of just work and like whether or not we want to have more kids. Like there's just a lot of life decisions that are still like TBC. And so I think in this situation, like if you have a very clear picture of what is high probability to happen in the next like short time, it makes that decision a little easier. We didn't really have a clear, you know, and we still don't. So we're just sort of sitting on it until we, I guess, have some more clarity or something happens that forces us into one particular route.
Yeah.
But I think for a lot of people here, you have that like trade-off of, do you want to be debt-free and is the mortgage kind of your number one priority, or do you have other potential upcoming young family-related expenses? Some people that might fall into this category are people that are thinking about sending their kids to private school, right? And so, you know, put yourself in that situation where it's like, you know, you maybe are going to have in the future some larger like expenses that need to be funded by cash, and you're not really sure how that's going to be funded. And so that would also then potentially be due reason to sit on some cash rather than funneling it towards your mortgage. So it's very situation dependent.
Yeah, nice.
Does that help?
Yeah, that was great.
It's like it's an answer but not an answer.
But also this kind of time of your life is like with a young family, from what I've seen with like the investors that we talk to and things, it's really a prioritization of like experience as well. So, you know, things like traveling together and like getting in the camper van and going camping and like all that kind of stuff. And so, you know, if you have the means and the ability to invest in that stuff and that's what you value, it's can be completely fine to do that as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think like it's probably worthwhile mentioning that lump sums can be tricky because depending on where the lump sum comes from, people can have very strong emotions as to like what they should do with that. So the source of the lump sum also can't necessarily be ignored. And, you know, one thing that I personally was, I guess, unsure about at the start is I'm like, I don't necessarily just want this money to just come into like all the money that we have and just, I don't know, like in 10 years from now, you're like, what did we really do with that? Like it sort of maybe moved us in the right direction, but not necessarily. Like I do want to be perhaps a little bit more like thoughtful with maybe we've purposefully used some to go on family holidays, which is actually what we're going to do this year for experiences and that kind of thing and be really considered about that. And so that has also meant that we've been comfortable to just sort of park it in a place where we are at least earning some interest, but also just have the time to really see how that plays out.
Yeah, nice.
What becomes important.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. So good. And so the answer is basically it's very complicated and it's kind of dependent on your situation.
There's no right answer.
Yeah, great. Which leads us on to scenario 3 of I have a lump sum of money or I've come into money, I have a mortgage, I have kids that have moved out of the house and now I potentially want to enjoy some more free time with that one.
Yeah, like thinking about maybe
or travel
transitioning to retirement or that kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, I think this is where the situation or the decision point becomes a little bit more like, what is your time horizon in terms of how long do you want to continue working if you are working? And if you're not working and you do have a small mortgage or a mortgage remaining, like what's kind of your plan to be debt-free in retirement and how important is that? Because that then is a challenge of, you know, if the balance is spend some of it to enjoy life now, i.e. on travel, but if you did that meant you wouldn't be able to pay off your mortgage, well, how are you going to feel, you know, 5 or 10 years from that point if you're then needing to like be forced into other decisions, i.e. downsizing in order to be debt-free. So I feel like in some ways once you're past that like stage of young family, tons of moving factors, your parameters tend to narrow a little bit, right? And it kind of not forces you into one direction, but it almost just, I guess, provides some sense of clarity because most people, generalization here, but most people will be thinking about, okay, what time, like when do I want to generally retire?
Yeah.
What does that look like? Do I want to be debt free? How important is that? Do I want to stay in this house? You know, so then you tend to kind of really just have like one or two options to think about.
Yeah, nice. It is making me really think about like planning for the future or having someone that can ask those questions, because I think it would be quite easy to be like, oh, well, we'll just go on a holiday or whatever. But at what cost? Or like, you know, what is that going to cost you in the future when retirement might feel like it's approaching soon?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, you know, to your question at the start about like when would I see an advisor, you do also need to factor in age, right? Because if you go back to the very first situation, kind of the assumption there was that was possibly a younger person. You have much longer time available in your life to course correct, right? So perhaps there is less impetus on needing to seek advice because you have more time to change course or do something different. When you're at that later stage in life and you are approaching time where you're not going to have any more income, you have a lot less time to course correct. And so even though the lump sum may be the same amount of money, if your time horizon is kind of shortening in terms of how much time you have to put that money to work, the obligation to feel like you're making the right decision becomes almost a bit heavier. And so that's where we tend to see people that are approaching that, you know, 50 plus age wanting to seek advice.
Yeah, exactly. Olive and I were literally talking about this thing, but flipped on the other way, in that, like, you know, what is the sacrifice of not investing that money now while we're young, because you do really have a lot of time to then have it grow, and then when you hit
can
your
make
50s,
mistakes and it'll still be fine because you've got time on your side.
Exactly. But then when you hit your 50s, you maybe could have more money to then be able to do more of that travel if you were sacrificing now.
Yes.
So, yeah, I mean, no right answer, but lots of things to consider.
Time is your friend.
Yeah, exactly. So moving on to the next question.
Yes.
Kat, hi, I earn a decent income, but life feels very expensive, especially with a family. Do you have any tips for continuing to grow my and my family's net worth whilst juggling rising mortgage rates from 2.5% to roughly 7.5%, cost of living, etc.?
Yeah. Great question. Okay, so I would say this actually blends perfectly from what we were just talking about. I think in any situation, but particularly this situation, the only thing that you can really use on your side is time. And I guess lean into the fact that even when your expenses are increasing, if you still have a lot of time on your side, small amounts do still make a significant difference, right? So in a situation where people's expenses, i.e. mortgages, are going from say 2.5 to 7.5, we know that from a dollar point of view, that is going to take out a much larger chunk of money that was potentially previously available for investing or saving or other goals. Trying to get to a point where you're still setting something aside, even if it is like a much, much smaller portion of what you had previously doing, is important because it's those habits that will continue. And I think in the moment of life feeling expensive, seeing like $10 a week being invested or $20 a week rather than $200 a week feels like you're going nowhere. But that $20 a week today, if you are 35, will matter when you're 60. Yeah. And so I think it's just like recognizing within yourself that you're still making progress, even if it feels like comparative to the progress that you've made in prior years to not be important. It's still progress. Yeah, nice. Love it. It's about the consistent habit. Yeah, totally. Yeah. Because also, I guess if you are, you know, continuing to invest regularly, you're going to dollar cost average and still get the ups and downs of the market. So hopefully it like evens out as well. You know, and it's like we can't control interest rates, and there is only, as we've talked about before, so much that you can cut out of your budget. If you are, you know, in this situation and you have a family, like you still have to pay the supermarket bill. You can go to supermarkets that potentially cost a little less, but they're not necessarily making meaningful chunks. Like, I think, you know, if you really want to go hard, there are lots of great resources that have tips to actually try and cut expenses. But if you can just focus on still investing and saving a certain amount and then focus on just living on the rest, that is kind of my easier approach to do it. Yeah. And then if you're struggling, like readjust what that amount is. So I think at the moment, like as an example, we still have our $20 a week going into Lily's account for her, and we have $390 a fortnight going into our savings, which sometimes stays in our savings, sometimes has to come back into our like every day because we're finding like the same thing as these people, like variation of bills a little bit tricky to manage. I'm okay with that. I'm like, at least the $390 is getting there anyway. And if we need to spend it, that's okay. But it's more about like the habits being maintained. And then beyond that, we are doing, I think from memory, it's $150 a fortnight into our investments.
Yeah, okay.
To
Nice.
hopefully
So
still
consistent.
continue.
Yeah, cool.
And sometimes, like particularly in lump, you know, ebbs and flows. Like at the moment, classic case, I had some direct debits. I had a direct debit set up for our rates. I didn't realize, but it had failed twice. And so then it cancelled just because of like mismatch of pay. And I didn't realize. And then, of course, we got sent our rates bill. And so we now have like a much higher just lump sum bill that I'm not used to paying because usually it was just being taken out. And that for me, I'm like, well, okay, we can just take, you know, $1,000 out of our investments because we'd been doing the 140 or 150 a fortnight anyway. And I just realized that this was an oversight and I feel okay about doing that. But it's more about we're trying to maintain the habit, you know, consistently and manage it that way.
Yeah, nice. What about like trying to increase your income in the kind of current economic environment as well? Because, you know, there is multiple stories about
fascinating you say
redundancy.
current environment because I'm like, I actually think this year would be very hard to do that.
Yeah, exactly. That's
Like,
what I mean.
yeah.
I mean, you know, we've talked about expenses, but what about income?
I mean, I think, you know, we obviously stand on the side of the argument that you should always make sure you're being paid what you're worth and you're having pay reviews and everything. I think what we've probably seen, though, in the last 12 months in particular is that it's become more of an employer's market right now than an employee's. And a lot of people don't necessarily have a ton of room to negotiate in the way that they have in the past. That said, if you're in a job that, you know, you've been in for a couple of years and you haven't had any kind of pay review in line with inflation, I would absolutely be encouraging someone to have that conversation because we know in the past 2 years inflation has been a lot higher and maybe just approaching it that way. But also, you know, I think the reality is for a lot of people with families, it's just not necessarily worth the time trade-off or the stress trade-off. And it's perhaps better to just try and make it through the current living environment with the means that you have and being okay and not giving yourself a hard time.
Yeah, nice. Be kind to yourself.
Yeah,
Love it. Okay,
exactly.
cool. 2 more questions. Let's pump these out. How do I plan my finances around my kids? So we have just had one kid, not me specifically, but obviously this person, and are thinking about having another one in the near future, but the financial side of it is raising some more questions. Specifically, how do I weigh up the costs / trade-offs of daycare versus one parent staying at home to parent versus a nanny for 2 kids? Let's start there.
Let's start there.
Yep.
Okay. So if you are the type of person that genuinely wants to see what the trade-off is from a monetary point of view, and I'm guessing that based on this question they are, I would just say just do the maths so that you know what that is and go from there. So as an example, how would you do that? Let's say I am currently at home not earning any income because I'm looking after a child. The easiest way to think about what I would earn, whether it's on a 5-day-a-week full-time salary, 3 days, whatever that variation is, jump on payee.net, chuck in your salary that you were earning or that you would expect to earn, chuck in, you can do your full-time equivalent hours or part thereof to see what your part-time pay would be and literally write that number down. So whatever is the easiest number for you to kind of conceptualize, let's say it's fortnightly or it's weekly. So most daycare centres charge weekly. So let's just say you pick a weekly number, right? So weekly, as an example, you're going to earn after tax $750. I'm just making this up.
Yeah, fine. Go.
Then you would say, okay, go reach out to some daycares, ask them for their pay schedules. Pretty easy information. They'll give it to you. Find out what it is going to cost you to put your child in daycare for the days in which you want to go back to work, right? So let's say as an example, I can use Lily's because I do know this. I believe it is $254 a week for daycare.
For how many days?
3 days.
3 days.
3 days. So let's say a little bit higher. I think actually from memory it's $83 a day. So let's say it gets to, it's like $470 a week, round about.
Yeah.
Yep. So I would say, okay, I'm going to earn in my bank account $750 a week from going back to work full time. It's going to cost us $470 a week for Lily to go to daycare 5 days a week. How do I feel about that?
Yeah.
Is that for me and my family a valid net contribution, right? Where it starts to become trickier is the scale of your income versus the daycare cost and how many days a week you're earning, basically, right? So the blunt truth is if you're on the lower end of the earning spectrum because you're in a particular type of job and then you want to work part-time, you may be break even on that cost of sending your child to daycare, or it may even be costing you a little bit, right? But there are other benefits outside of just the direct cost to your household for that individual for going back to work. So on top of that, they'll be getting KiwiSaver contributions. They'll be continuing to grow their retirement contributions. They will be continuing to grow their career, even if it's in a part-time capacity. You will be getting other types of, social, emotional, like well-being benefits from working in general. You'll also be stressed because being a working parent is just stressful in general. So let's call that out. But, I think that's where if you are the type of person that wants to approach it from a numbers point of view, you can do that quite simply to just say, this is the numbers, right? And then let's think about the things around the numbers that either add or detract to the decision of going back to work or paying for childcare.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Yep, totally. And you would just multiply that out for the additional kids, basically.
It absolutely becomes harder when you have a second child because then let's say even your income stays the same. It's not like your income's going to double. Lols, we wish. But let's say your income stays the same. Yeah. But then depending on the ages of your children, so this is kind of, a crucial call out, kids at daycare don't get the government funding portion until they're 3. So for some parents, depend on how quickly you have your children, like in age groups, there is possibilities that a working family would have 2 children under the age of 3 in daycare together or in some kind of care together, that neither of those children is getting funding. So let's say that was a situation for us. We would then be paying, $470 a week times 2.
That's above your $750.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But if that was a decision that we made because my career was important to me and we knew that that was a short-term financial hit that would result in longer-term financial gain because progression was required or, it was something that would happen for 6 months before perhaps the government funding did kick in, it may vary the decision. I don't think it should be as black as white as you're not going to earn as much or more than what childcare is going to cost you. Therefore, you should not work.
Yeah. Yeah. I can completely understand that.
Yeah. But I think that is where, particularly when you have the second child come in, that's where people particularly start looking around alternative options like having live-in care or shared care with other families because depending on the age of those children, it can be more cost effective to do it that way and potentially more flexible for the family.
Do you mean like an au pair or
or a nanny? Because, your nanny may have more of a fixed cost to be comfortable with 2 kids as opposed to like a daycare is like 1 child and a second child is just double the cost. Whereas a nanny might be like, okay, well, this is kind of my fixed cost for the day and then having a second child is only this amount more effort. I'm not going to charge you double.
Yeah. Makes sense. Love it. Nice. Great. Yeah. So interesting. I did not know that.
I've also just caveat that it's like the childcare thing is a household cost. It's not a cost to the person returning to work. Person. Yeah, that's true. You do need to think of it as a point of like, this is a cost that's coming into your household budget. It's not a cost that should just be deducted off the returning to work person's income.
True. Yeah, that's a good point.
And then from my point of view, I'm like, well, if you're debating that and someone wants to return to work and you're like, well, the cost is quite high, I would say it's a valid reason to look through every other cost in your budget and say, well, do I value spending $3,000 a year on gym and exercise versus some of that money going towards childcare so that we can do other things in our career or have time off work or whatever that be,
Yeah. So you would look at let's say you have 2 people in a relationship, you've got double income, you would look at that total income and then total expenses, not necessarily just to the one person.
Yes.
Yeah. Love that.
Yes, because children are a shared responsibility
yes.
and therefore a shared cost.
Yes, here for it. Okay, so the second part of this question, which I think you've kind of also implied how you would get to this answer, but will my partner be able to take another year off or 6 months, depending on the mat leave, agreement after the first child financially, i.e. what is the cost of maternity and paternity leave?
Yeah. I think this is where it really can become a bit tricky. And again, it's one of those things of like run the numbers on where you're at, because there are some nuances around if you want to get the government parental leave again, you need to have met certain hours and work requirements for a period of time, i.e.
really?
you can't just roll into like having a baby, have parental leave, not work, and then have more parental leave. It doesn't work that way. You need to have work requirements.
Yep.
Similarly, if you have an employer that supports you with additional parental leave payments, they probably have in their policy or your contract requirements to have worked for a certain period of time or be back at work for a certain period of time in between breaks off in order to be paid, because that's kind of fair, right? Like it's reasonable. So I think it's, firstly, like if you're doing the family planning stuff, have a look at what those requirements are and then whether or not you're even going to meet them.
Yeah.
And then start thinking about, okay, well, how long is that person going to want to have off? And once they are off, what are our costs going to be? So one thing that I think sometimes catches people out is, let's say in our personal scenario, we're like, okay, Lily is in 5 days a week of daycare or childcare. If we were to have another child, it might be really easy for us to assume like, I'll be at home with this baby, so I'll also just look after Lily. So we'll then cut that cost of daycare, right?
Yeah, okay,
but really thinking through, is that actually a reality? Is it possible for me as the primary carer in that situation to be at home with a newborn and let's say like a 3-year-old? Is that possible? Or do we also need to factor in that child, the older child, needs to be in some childcare? It is a little bit harder than the going from 0 to 1 because you do have more of those costs to consider.
Yeah.
And that, leading back to the earlier question of like why we've parked that money somewhere is it's like we don't even know how much it would cost us for us to have like another child yet, because there are higher costs on both ends and I just don't really know who would do what and what the general vibe is. So tricky. Whereas then there are some people that are like, oh, I would absolutely love to stay at home with both kids. And so it would kind of be a net neutral position, because whilst I'm not earning income or, only getting the government parental leave, we're also not going to have our child in daycare. Therefore, it's a bit more doable.
Yeah. Nice. Love
but planning.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, it sounds like, to your point of we kind of don't know, but we can plan to a certain point.
Yes,
it's like
exactly.
sometimes you just also kind of have to like do the thing and see what happens.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, sometimes people think like, oh, planning means I have to be saving. And it's not necessarily that. Planning just means like knowing if that happened tomorrow and one person was off work looking after a child at home, could you survive on the rest of your income? And if the answer is no, then that's when you have to plan, right? And if the answer is yes, maybe there is room to start acting like that before the situation happens, and that's therefore how you save some money to then potentially still have a bit of flexibility whilst someone's off work.
Yes. Love it. Great.
Spending time in your life.
Yeah.
Good luck.
You will get through it.
Yeah.
Okay, last question is bonds taking a very sharp turn to the left or right.
Lols, great.
Yeah. So we are obviously in a higher interest rate environment, and bonds seem to have become increasingly popular, or even just a topic of conversation. Is this an asset class I should be looking into, assuming I have no personal debt and an emergency fund and therefore want to invest?
Great question. I was actually just thinking as you were reading this that last year we were like, oh my God, the cash plus fund, or like cash funds are having a glow up. And I'm like, maybe bonds are having a glow up.
Are there bonds in the cash plus fund?
No, but just in general.
Oh, right.
But okay, so let's just really simply break this down. Bond is basically a fixed income investment. It is therefore more on the defensive end. It is not as safe and secure and defensive as just straight cash, i.e. keeping money in a bank account, but it is much less risk than, say, investing in shares or investing in property. So it sits on the spectrum of like how much risk, therefore what kind of return you would want it to get from an investment.
Yep.
Now, Should you be looking at it just because they sound great right now? That's not a really good reason to look at any investment, because one could have said the same thing about Bitcoin 3 years ago.
Yep, valid.
However, that doesn't necessarily, you should ignore the asset class if you are investing in more defensive investments for a reason. And if we think about kind of our investment 101 chats that we've had before, why would I be investing in a defensive asset class? Probably because I have a shorter dated goal, or I'm putting some money aside for something that I want to do sometime in the next, 2 to 3 to 4 years, or I'm a very conservative person.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, absolutely have a look at bonds. If you're also currently right now thinking about investing in cash or a cash fund or term deposits, they are different and more potentially risky and a different type of investment, but similar in the sense that they would be categorized into kind of a conservative asset class.
Nice. Yeah.
Does
correct.
that, yeah?
Yeah. You might have just answered this, but so if I was choosing between, like, let's say the cash fund, and bonds, like, quite similar but also different.
Yep, exactly. Quite similar in the sense of both being classified as a defensive asset allocation and having a lower risk rating, different in the sense of investing in slightly different types of actual underlying investments, i.e. a cash fund would literally have some cash investments like high yielding bank accounts with larger organizations or, main banks, whereas a bond is not doing that. A bond is a totally different type of instrument. So there is a little bit more risk and potentially slightly different exposure to different types of investments. But, you would typically see an advisor, or if you looked at, a conservative diversified fund in a QSaver environment, you would likely see both, cash investments and bond investments in that type of portfolio.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Nice.
Yeah. So you might already own a bond and you don't even know it.
Oh, yeah. So go check out your KiwiSaver fund and have a look.
I will caveat the reason that, because maybe this is not clear, but the reason people buy bond funds is because to buy a bond in itself, like a term deposit, is very challenging from a retail point of view.
Yeah,
Bonds are sold at like much, much larger multiples of a dollar value, right? So you could go to a bank and buy a term deposit with $30,000.
Yeah.
You're not going to have a look in if you've got $30,000 to buy a bond, right? They're priced differently and they will be in the realm of, hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars.
Okay, that's a very good distinction.
So people are buying a fund because a fund, of course, is pooling money and therefore has the capacity to buy
those,
direct bonds and hold those bonds. You and I can't just rock up to like Auckland Airport and buy a bond that they have on offer.
Yeah. Yeah, nice. Okay, cool. And we are going to do an episode on bonds because I, for the life of me, will just never fully understand
we'll
them.
sub in the experts for that.
Yeah.
I'm like a fake bond expert.
Or at least you know what they are. Oh, yeah. So thank you for listening, and thanks Kat, for sharing all your knowledge.
Yeah, thanks for bringing in the questions. Love this. Love this format.
Yes. So if you do have any questions that you'd like us to answer on the grand spectrum of anything related to money, please do slide into our DMs at It's No Secret NZ on Instagram. You can also email us at the website www.itsnosecret.co.nz.
Yeah, that's it.
But until next week, we will say see you later. Thanks for tuning in. Bye.